Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. In today's story, a simple cash for keys agreement turns into a lesson in entitlement when a couple decides they deserve the payout without doing the one thing required to earn it. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with a turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. The most expensive tantrum I've seen. When I was working as a property shepherd for banks that had foreclosed on homes, one of my regular assignments was what people often call cash for keys. The banks wanted the houses back without dragging everything through a long, ugly eviction, and they definitely didn't want their lawyers handling negotiations that didn't strictly require legal work. Lawyers billed hundreds of dollars an hour. I was much cheaper. My role was simple and very clearly defined. I didn't foreclose on anyone. I did not evict anyone. I didn't make decisions, and I didn't have authority to bend rules. The bank and their attorneys drafted the agreement, set the timeline, and issued the check. I was just the messenger and the verifier. I'd present the offer, explain the terms, inspect the property at the end, and if everything was clean and intact, I'd hand over the check. One thing that people often didn't understand or pretended not to understand was that the eviction clock never stopped. If I didn't report compliance, the eviction continued automatically. I couldn't grant extensions. I couldn't just give them a few extra days. The best I could do was something like, if the agreement says be out by the 14th and you're clearly almost done, I can come back first thing in the morning, inspect, and report compliance before the bank opens. That was it. No magic, no discretion. This particular job involved a couple living in a roughly 4,000 square foot house, big place. They had spent months fighting the foreclosure and then the eviction. By the time I got involved, the bank and the lawyers were done playing. They wanted the house back without more drama. The offer was straightforward, $3,500 if they were out in 2 weeks and left the house clean and intact. I made it crystal clear that I wasn't the bank and I wasn't the lawyers. Apparently that didn't matter because a few days later they showed up at my office anyway, not to ask questions but to try to convince us to sell them the house. The house that wasn't for sale. The house they couldn't afford or they wouldn't be facing eviction. The house we didn't own. They didn't like hearing any of that. The conversation ended with them telling us we'd better start checking under our cars before starting them, then storming out. Subtlety was not their strength. Despite that, I still did what I always did. I wanted them to succeed. I've always believed that if someone's willing to do the work, they deserve the money. I offered to do a pre-inspection a few days early and point out exactly what needed to be done so there were no surprises. Normal wear and tear? Fine. Old stains on carpet? I don't care unless it looked intentional. This wasn't a security deposit. Missing fixtures? Problem. Trash everywhere? Problem. Rotting food bags in the garage? Definitely a problem. When I did the pre-inspection, the house wasn't even close. I walked them through room by room, pointing out what needed to be cleaned, repaired, or removed. They nodded along and then asked if I could give them the check now so they could hire cleaners and promised it would all be perfect by the deadline. I declined. I wasn't being cruel. I wasn't stupid. I told them I'd see them on the agreed date. When I came back on that date, nothing had changed. Same trash, same grime, same missing fixtures. They demanded the check anyway. They cycled through excuses at impressive speed. They were exhausted. They were stressed. They needed the money for a down payment on another house. Wouldn't I do them a favor? They were willing to do anything for that check, except clean. I marked them non-compliant, left the property, and returned the check to the lawyers. About a week later, the law office told me I was clear to take possession and start my normal post-eviction processes. When I went back in, the place was still a disaster. Trash everywhere, dirt ground into the floors, several light fixtures gone. The highlight, though, was the bathrooms. They had taken every towel rack and toilet paper holder, ripping them straight out of the walls. Not unscrewed, ripped, along with chunks of drywall. I remember standing there thinking how strange it is when people decide to teach someone a lesson by damaging a house that doesn't belong to the person they're mad at. For skipping maybe 3 hours of cleaning, they walked away from $3,500. Money they probably could have really used. Money they arguably deserved for the stress they'd been under. All they had to do was clean. Their own actions is what separates the wheat from the chaff. They were given a great opportunity to restart their life with a $3,500 bonus instead of continuing to be inconsiderate, lazy idiots to their own detriment. And our next story. Entitled neighbor let party guests block my driveway repeatedly. We had two neighbors on one side for years who were genuinely great. Friendly but not nosy, quiet but not weird about it. The kind of people you wave to, borrow a ladder from once a year, and maybe share a beer with over the fence. Then they moved out and a new woman moved in. At first, she mostly kept to herself, didn't introduce herself, didn't wave, didn't complain either. Fine by me, not everyone wants to be buddy-buddy with the neighbors. We figured she was just private. That assessment lasted about 3 weeks. That's when the party started. Now, I'm not anti-party. People have birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, whatever. But this wasn't a couple friends over with music. This was full-blown, loud, late suburban house parties with cars lining the street, bass thumping through walls, and people yelling outside after dark like they were at a nightclub that somehow landed in a cul-de-sac. At least twice we had to ask people not to park in our driveway or directly across it, blocking us in. Both times it was met with eye-rolling and muttered comments, but they did eventually move. We let it go, assuming maybe guests didn't know better. Then came that night. It was one of the biggest parties yet. Music loud enough that you couldn't ignore it, people spilling into the yard, constant door slamming. I stayed inside for most of it because I had no interest in being that neighbor. Eventually, I realized I'd left something in the car and went out to grab it. That's when I did a full stop and stared. There was a massive catering truck parked squarely in our driveway. Not half in, not kind of close, fully, confidently, professionally parked like it had always belonged there. Big logo on the side, engine off, no driver in sight. At first, I was honestly more confused than angry. My first thought was, they've got the wrong address. It happens. So I walked around the truck, checked the house numbers, checked my house number, and then looked back at the neighbor's place, where the party was very much still raging. Nope, this was intentional. I gave them the benefit of the doubt. I figured I'd knock, explain the mistake, and they'd apologize and move it. Our houses have glass panels in the front doors. You can see straight into the entryway. I rang the bell, knocked, rang again. People inside looked directly at me, made eye contact, then turned away. The door was locked. I knocked harder. Still nothing. Finally, an older guy came out a side door. English clearly wasn't his first language. I told him calmly that there was a catering truck parked in my driveway and it needed to be moved immediately. He nodded, said okay, and told me he'd let the neighbor know. She never came out. At that point, I stopped being confused and started being angry. I turned back toward my house, already pulling my phone out to call for a tow, when I noticed movement in her garage. Some of the catering staff were unloading equipment. So I walked over to them. I kept my voice level, polite but firm. I told them the truck was parked in my driveway and needed to be moved now. One of them said the neighbor told them it was fine to park there and that they'd only be a little longer. I told them I didn't care what she said. It wasn't her driveway, it was mine, and they were trespassing. They shrugged. One actually turned his back on me. That's when I said, okay, I'm calling a tow truck. That got their attention. Suddenly, there was urgency. One of them jogged off to find the driver. Another called me an a-hole under his breath. I stood there and waited, arms crossed, while they slowly, very begrudgingly, moved the truck. They didn't apologize. They didn't even acknowledge me once it was out of the driveway. 2 weeks later, another party, smaller but still loud. This time, multiple guests parked in ways that partially blocked our driveway. I went out and asked one to move. He refused and said the neighbor told him it was fine. That was the moment I realized this wasn't ignorance, this was entitlement. So the next time it happened, I didn't knock, I didn't ask, I called a tow company. When the tow truck showed up, suddenly everyone wanted to talk. Guests ran out, phones came out, the neighbor finally appeared, furious, demanding to know who called the tow. I told her I did. She screamed that I was overreacting, that it was just for a few hours, and that I should have talked to her instead of calling a tow. I told her I'd tried to talk to her, and she ignored me multiple times. The tow driver asked whose driveway it was. I pointed. He hooked the car. That's when the owner of the car started begging, offering to move it now, apologizing profusely. The tow driver shrugged and said, too late. Once it's hooked, it's going. I stood there silently while the car was hauled away. After that, things got quiet. No more parties, no more guests blocking driveways, no more catering trucks. The neighbor never apologized, never explained, never spoke to us again. Frankly, that was fine with me. I still have no idea why she thought any of that was okay. But I do know this. Once people realize you'll actually follow through, the problems tend to solve themselves. And I've never seen another vehicle in my driveway since. You tried to resolve it like an adult. She chose avoidance and entitlement instead. Calling a tow wasn't petty, it was the only remaining option. People love saying, "You should have talked to me first," but that only works when they're willing to answer the door. And our next story. She thought dating a deployed soldier entitled her to his car. This one goes back to around 2008, and it's still my favorite story from my buddy Chuck's time working repos in Texas. Chuck had just gotten out of the military after a decade in uniform. He started in the Marines, switched to the Army for his last 4 years, then bought a house near Fort Hood when he finally came home for good. Like a lot of guys transitioning back to civilian life, he bounced between jobs for a bit before landing work with a local repo company. The job paid decently, the hours were wild, and the stories were endless. Most of them were funny, some were sketchy, but this one stuck because it ended with someone absolutely earning every consequence they got. One afternoon, Chuck was in the office talking with his manager. Her real name wasn't Karen, but it fits so perfectly it might as well have been. She had the haircut, the voice, the stare that could curdle milk, but in a strange twist of fate, she was a Karen who used her powers for good. While they were mid-conversation, a young guy walked in and immediately sucked the air out of the room. He had 2 black eyes, his arm was in a sling, and he moved like every step hurt. Karen stopped mid-sentence, told Chuck to hold on, and called her daughter, who also worked there, out front. They sat the guy down, handed him a coffee, and Karen leaned against the desk and said calmly, "All right, tell me what happened." The guy introduced himself. I never caught his real name, so I'll call him Ben. Ben explained that he'd just gotten back from deployment. Before shipping out, he'd been dating a local girl near Fort Hood. Anyone stationed there knows that's already playing on a hard mode. Before he met her, Ben had bought himself a used black Dodge Charger. It was his pride and joy, something he'd saved for and babied. The girlfriend, let's call her Greta, loved that car, constantly asked to drive it. Ben always said no. When deployment orders came down, she ramped up the pressure. She wanted the car while he was gone. Ben refused again until she wore him down. He finally agreed on one condition. She'd look after his apartment until he came back for leave. Keep it clean, make sure nothing went missing. Greta agreed, swore she'd handle everything. Ben deployed. Months later, he came back on leave. His apartment looked spotless. Greta brought the Charger out of storage. He drove it over, spent a few days with her, then handed her the keys again before heading back home to see family. Everything seemed fine. Then he came home for real. The apartment looked abandoned, dust everywhere, no signs anyone had lived there in months. His bedroom had been torn apart, drawers dumped, clothes thrown around like someone had been searching for something. He checked his safe, hidden well out of sight, untouched. He tried calling Greta, no answer. He grabbed the spare key from the safe, called a buddy, and they drove to her place. That's when Ben saw his car. At first, he didn't recognize it. Then it hit him. Same shape, same dents, same rims underneath all the nonsense. Greta had painted it hot pink and slapped enormous chrome spinners on it. It looked like a Barbie toy had exploded. Ben unlocked it, the lights flashed, his buddy laughed in disbelief. Ben walked up to the door and asked Greta what the hell she'd done. She crossed her arms and said flatly, "It's my car now." Ben didn't argue. He turned around, got in the Pepto-Bismol nightmare, and started it. That's when 4 massive guys poured out of the house. One had a baseball bat. They dragged Ben out, beat him in the driveway, and only stopped when his friend pulled his concealed carry and leveled it at them. Ben woke up in the hospital. Broken bones, concussion. The Charger disappeared. Back in Karen's office, the room was dead silent when Ben finished. Karen stared at him for a few seconds, then said, "Do you have the paperwork?" Ben handed over the title and registration. Karen smiled, a real smile, the kind that means someone else's day is about to get very bad. She asked for Greta's phone number. Ben gave it, confused. Karen passed the phone to her daughter, who dialed and put on her best party girl voice. She told Greta they'd met at a club, said she and some friends were going out that night, and asked if Greta wanted to come. Greta was very interested. That night, Chuck parked his tow truck near the club. Right on time, Greta rolled up in the pink Charger, parked out front, and went inside with her friends. Chuck waited 5 minutes, hooked it up clean and quiet, and rolled out. Greta came stumbling out of the club just in time to see her car leaving on a flatbed. She screamed. Chuck never slowed down. The next morning, Greta called the office in a rage, demanding her stolen car back. Karen answered sweetly and told her she was welcome to retrieve it if she brought the registration. Greta threatened to call the cops. "Please do," Karen said, and hung up. As this happened, Chuck glanced out the window and noticed Greta nearby, sitting in another car parked in a vacant lot, throwing a full-blown tantrum. Karen followed his gaze, nodded once, and picked up the phone again. She called the owner of the lot and asked if he wanted the unauthorized vehicle removed. He absolutely did. Chuck drove over and told Greta and her friend they couldn't park there. They insulted him, argued, refused to move, so Chuck hooked the car and lifted it just enough to force them out. They kept screaming until he showed them the tow authorization. That's when Ben walked into the office. Greta saw him through the glass and lost her mind. She rushed the door, tried to grab the keys from him, and started hitting his injured arm. She threatened to call her friends again to finish it. Karen's daughter had already called the police. Chuck stepped between them and told Greta very calmly to try hitting him instead. She switched tactics instantly, claiming she just needed her laptop for school. Karen told Ben to hand the keys to Chuck so he could grab it. Chuck got the laptop, Greta lunged for it, knocked it out of his hands, and then screamed that he'd destroyed it on purpose. She threatened to sue everyone in the building. That's when the cops walked in. Greta launched into a sob story about her stolen car. Karen asked the officers if they wanted to see the security footage. They did. The video showed Greta assaulting Ben, making threats, and trying to escalate the situation. Greta turned pale. The officers asked her about the car, the assault, and the men she'd sent after Ben. She tried to deny everything until they replayed the footage. She was arrested on the spot. Ben got his Charger back. He took one look at the paint job and said he was trading it in immediately. Last I heard, he wanted a GTO and something a lot less pink. Through the grapevine, Chuck later heard that Greta flipped on the 4 guys who jumped Ben. Every single one of them was arrested. Chuck told me plenty of repo stories over the years, but none of the others had timing that clean, karma that sharp, or a Karen who knew exactly when to smile. Ben deserves a lot of credit here. After getting beaten and hospitalized, he didn't go hunting for revenge. He showed up, told the story, and handed over documents. That's restraint most people don't have, especially after betrayal like that. The contrast between his composure and Greta's behavior is stark. One person trusted the system, the other relied on intimidation. Only one of those paths works long-term, and this story is a clean demonstration of why. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.